and I am going to, I'm monitoring the chat as well. So what you see here is a scene. It's what we try and create. We have a program called the Living. Whoops. Why does it always do that to me? Sorry about that. I didn't think it did that anymore. Um, Ultimately, we have a program called the Living Reef Action Campaign that I'll talk about today, and it's where we enhance. What you see at the bottom of this picture here is something called reef balls. We build these through our programming with students and partners around the state, and it's to uplift the ecosystem, all the grasses, the critters, the clean water, clear water that we want, in a diverse mix of species is what is most important. And as a recreational fishing based organization or focused organization, we believe that if we provide habitat today, we have fish tomorrow. It's that pretty simple. And we're going to talk a lot about that habitat because oysters are the most important. So as an organization, our purpose is to advise and educate the public on the conservation of marine resources. Our objective is to conserve, promote, and enhance the present and future availability of coastal resources for the benefit and enjoyment of the general public. And our focus is ensuring the health and conservation of our coastal resources and anglers' access to them. And those are our kind of broad visionary stuff that we focus on, our mission, our objective throughout the country. We have chapters, as I said, around the country. We were founded in Houston, Texas in 1977. And the four components of CCA are on the screen now. They, as a membership organization, when we were founded, we were started by 14 people. They got together in a tackle shop and they were quite upset with the status of speckled trout, redfish, their most important game fish on the Texas Gulf Coast. And at the time, there were really no rules and regulations to make sure that fish were conserved for the future. And so ultimately, they decided to create an organization called the Gulf Coast Conservation Association, the GCCA, focused largely on advocacy, the 6 o'clock position there on the screen. They wanted to advocate and change the rules, change the laws that were prevailing that were not protecting these fish. And this is in the 70s, late 70s, 1977. This is just after our federal government passed the Magnuson-Stevens Fisheries Conservation Reform Act, which put into place our exclusive economic zones off our coasts, and ultimately our management system, which has evolved ever since. And so CCA is an advocacy group at its core, brings people together to represent them, to advise and educate them, as I said before. And that's been our core in every state chapter. We have fully operational state chapters from the state of Maryland, south all the way to Texas, around the entire coastline, the full West Coast, and then an inland chapter in Nashville, Tennessee. We have some volunteers and leadership up in New England as well, but there's just different history there with their chapters. They're not as active as they used to be. But next year, CCA Maryland will be celebrating our 30th anniversary. And so ultimately, habitat, as you see also on here, is a key piece of the puzzle. Without healthy habitat, you're not going to have fish. Fish are the driving force behind it. And most of our fundraising, most of our work we do, most of the funds we raise are raised here in Maryland. We're supported through membership fundraising dinners. We had a fundraising banquet at Union Craft Brewing in Baltimore December 5th this year, and we've had multiple other chapters throughout the state. So as an organization, that's our ecosystem, and I get the honor of leading the state chapter and representing lots of volunteers on the policy side of things in Annapolis, but also in the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission, which is a coastwide compact that was set up in order to manage fisheries that we share amongst our Atlantic coast states. So it's a body of states from Maine to Florida, sort of exercising states' rights and doing a little bit of an experiment. It truly is a compact. It does have federal support, but it's not through the federal law. And so it provides the states flexibility to manage their shared resources. Oysters, which are not a migratory species, thankfully don't have to move. And so that's a Maryland thing for us. They're managed on a state level and they're managed on a county level. But why are they managed? Well, you manage something because you want to maintain some level of it, sustainability. And ultimately, with an oyster as a keystone species, I think most folks may understand what a keystone is, but we do this work with students too, and I always quiz them which one of the original 13 colonies is the Keystone State. And I hope this group will know that, so whoever throws in the chat wins the prize. But ultimately, a keystone, of course, holds things together just like a state that somebody's going to guess in the chat. There it is. Nancy wins the prize. Pennsylvania is our keystone state, our neighbors to the north. And so ultimately, Why is it a keystone? It's a keystone because it filters water. It removes nutrients through eating algae. That's its day-to-day grazing of algae, sucking in water, bringing it in as food. It also brings in other things that are floating in the watershed or up in the water column, sediment, other things that it can bring in and then spit out if it can't eat, but bring them out of the water column, clearing the water. They build their own shell. They build their own reefs that provide habitat and home for so many other animals, as you see in the image. Those are striped bass. There's a crab claw down at the bottom. There's sponges. There's aquatic vegetation. There's anemones, tunicates, all sorts of stuff you'll see in a video here shortly. Crabs, of course, that's such an important economic driver and seafood component of and part of our culture. Well, even before European settlement here, I mean, all these seafoods were feeding people here for a very long time. And so ultimately, we have that economic component, that socioeconomic, the cultural components, the historical components of seafood and its connection to the Chesapeake Bay. Chesapeake or Chesapeake is an Algonquin word that means Great Shellfish Bay, at least loosely. I believe that's one interpretation. Ultimately, the Chesapeake has been full of oysters for a very long time, but has changed just like everything does. Some of the biggest challenges we have in the Chesapeake that has impacted of course, the health of the watershed, but also just the state of the oyster. A watershed without people in it is always going to evolve and change, and you're going to see different things happen over different periods of time. So silting, erosion, those types of things are natural, but of course they're sped up by impervious surface and about 18 million people living inside this red blob right here. And so that large number of people living in the watershed ultimately means impervious surface. It means you've changed the dynamics of the watershed, of the water cycles, of what happens, what's filtered, what's not. And so oysters are at the end of the filter system. In a healthy bay, like this scene shows back on one side to the other, we're going to have submerged aquatic vegetation giving off oxygen, absorbing carbon, providing habitat, stabilizing sediments, enriching the water column with oxygen. That means animals can exist and thrive because they have that oxygen. But unfortunately, even with a 0-person situation in the Chesapeake Bay, you're going to have areas that have no oxygen. It's just the nature of the beast. They happen in pristine ecosystems. Hypoxic systems happen. Of course, there's no such thing as pristine anywhere, at least in our region. So ultimately, we have on the right a degraded ecosystem in one way, shape, or form or another. And we have nutrient runoff, which comes from all of us. It's in the air we breathe. It's ultimately it's put off out of our tailpipes. It's put off out of our tails into our sewage systems. It's a naturally occurring thing, right? Like most of what we're breathing is nitrogen gas, and nitrogen as a solid is the number 1 impact and nutrient that fuels the growth of algae and things that degrade the water quality, because as the algae die, they fall to the seafloor, and ultimately to be eaten by microbes that actually gives off or takes away the oxygen out of the system, creating that dead zone. There are portions of the Chesapeake, and I could absolutely recommend other complete experts at DNR and such that can talk about the history of the watershed and some water quality monitoring work they do that it's just top notch, and they help kind of really put a scientific perspective and data-driven perspective of what the degraded system is, how we're trending one way or another. Chesapeake Bay Foundation, also University of Maryland, UMCES, does some great report cards that show the trends in general. And people ask me all the time in my role, because I lead most of our advocacy work and a lot of our policy work, habitat work, they always ask, well, how's the Bay doing? Such a complex answer, but ultimately we're trying to make an impact, and we know we are, and we'll show you some of that here moving forward. And so ultimately, as I said, we do this work with students. You'll see some pictures of that here shortly, and we like to talk with them about what's the foundational reason why we care about this resource. Why are these government agencies involved in managing it? Why do we care? Like, what's our role as the public or an individual? And we start off with the very beginning of the concept of a public natural resource. So this is Emperor Justinian back in these years you see his reign in Rome. And he's believed to have said the seas, the shores of the sea, the air, and running water is common to everyone. I joke that I wonder if there was a scandal he was trying to pay people off with and just said, all right, never mind, you can have it all. But who knows? Ultimately, this concept was carried through into English common law, this idea of a public trust of these things held in public, in the public arena for the government to manage in some way. really in U.S. law and our environmental law. As I mentioned, Magnuson-Stevens Act was a fisheries law in 1976, driven by Alaska senators and congressmen. But the Clean Water Act, Clean Air Act, all these different environmental laws are under this concept that these agencies and the folks that we choose to represent us need to maintain these things for public trust. And so here and today, I can make it as simple as possible to say that these resources, most of the things we engage with, are managed by a government process that's public. The jurisdictional complexities are endless. I learn about new ones every single day. But thankfully, we do have an opportunity to present our voice, advocate for the resource through a process. And of course, we're very fortunate and privileged to have that opportunity. Sharing a public resource is never easy. I always explain to the students it's like sharing anything with siblings or friends. And that's just the reality of it. A resource is a finite thing, and managing it is difficult. It is subjective and objective. And with oysters, we have a very long history in the Chesapeake and some tremendous resources. For the readers, I would recommend Oyster Wars. It's a great book that talks about this, the period of the late 1800s, and something I'll actually switch right to here. Of course, the black and white photos. I don't know the exact dates on these. I want to say, I can actually see the one in the bottom left. I'm trying to read that caption. I can't read it. Anyway, these are a while back, and these are mountains of oyster shell. So we were talking about shell as we started. Shell is a finite resource. It's grown by the oyster, and as our population dwindles, so does the amount of shell, the abundance of shell in the Chesapeake. The Chesapeake's full of shell in certain places in certain ways, relatively, but nothing like what you see here in these images. And these were driven by massive levels of harvest, the ones with the people standing on them. In the bottom middle is a midden, or an area of shell that was found from an indigenous people. Could have been a campsite over time, seasonal harvest area. These are found all throughout portions of Maryland. There's quite a few in Calvert County, and I believe that's where this one is from. On the bottom right corner is just a colonial era wall that is built using oysters ground up for the limestone content to create the mortar to hold walls together. Here in Baltimore, there's an endless supply of oyster shell buried under row houses or being dug out when people underpin their basements. And oyster shell is a very complex thing, as I said. Only an oyster creates shell. And so I can talk about that a little bit in the future here. But to give you an idea of a visual of what harvest has done, I know this is a little bit small to see, but on the left side here on the y-axis, we're looking at oyster landings in bushels on the y-axis. So the starting point here is about 9 million bushels in 1870, peaking at about 15 million bushels in the 1880s and 90s, and then dropping off quite drastically in the early 1900s, and then bouncing through these periods of relative stability. And then oyster disease caused the real collapse in the 60s. But it really started in the 60s and 70s, but picked up steam in the 80s and 90s, leading to the lowest levels of harvest ever in 2003, I believe, was the year when we totally bottomed out from a fishery perspective. And of course, with that, you have these ups and downs. That's ups and downs for the ecosystem. That's ups and downs for the economy here in our state. And during some of these periods of peak harvest, of course, this is post-Civil War. This is a time period where people are looking for economic opportunity. There were part of the stories of the Oyster Wars are battles at sea, fighting between the fleets. And so with a lot of complexity that happened in the late 1800s of foreign fleets, foreign being from Massachusetts maybe, coming down here, or maybe the Maritimes of Canada coming to the Chesapeake to take oysters. There's a lot of conflict between local and foreign, or non-local. And ultimately, it brought about the forming of the Maryland Oyster Police, which is the beginning of the Natural Resources Police. So with all that conflict going on, ultimately, I believe it was Congress that underwrote this and moved forward with the Yates Survey. So this was our first baseline survey of oyster bars in the Chesapeake Bay from 1906 to 1913. Mr. Yates and his team traveled all throughout the Bay region using dragging chains, dropping poles, using lots of different survey techniques to create a baseline understanding of what's hard bottom, what is oyster bottom throughout the Chesapeake Bay. And we still use this today in defining a Yates bar or a location for harvest. There's lots of different overlapping complexities to oyster management, oyster restoration, et cetera. But Mr. Yates work was foundational and very important to our understanding of where oysters generally exist. Um, so here's a zoom in of more recent population and harvest. So this is the 1990 to start us off here. And you'll see we're down at a much lower scale, 400,000 bushels at a peak component here, starting this timeline. And then ultimately 03 here, as I mentioned, is the lowest point of harvest, something like 36,000 bushels harvested that year. This exact graph here was trying to show that yes, we've come up recently, but we're about to come back down. And ultimately, this boom and bust cycle is not healthy for the bay, not healthy for our economy. And back in I think it was 2017, we initiated some legislation to try and advance oyster the assessment of oyster populations and using science to better manage what is taken each year. Largely, things like this graph of harvest was really kind of our only metric to understand which direction is the oyster fishery going. And then following this period where this ends at 2015 into 2020 or so, some more regulations were put on the fishery. But ultimately, here's where we've gone. So that past graph left us here in 2015, 16. Now we're continuing on. You saw we went back down, just like we were concerned that we would, but have now gone up quite a bit. And everything's relative when it comes to oysters. People's perspectives of what's good and what's not is as diverse as you can imagine, especially when people have a front row seat when they're part of the harvesting community versus people that may be from conservation or environmental communities or have different goals in trying to conserve oysters. So it's great to see an uptick in harvest because we do know that means there's an uptick in population. But what we've been trying to do, and I specifically have worked on myself, is trying to balance this, land us in a place of sustainability or stability, meaning we look at an estimate of biomass that's out there because of a stock assessment and a survey that is done and scientifically prepared. And ultimately that helps us model what we think the actual population is. And then that should let us manage the industry to take only a certain percentage, at least place by place. So where are oysters harvested? Well, the Yates bars, but it's more complicated than that. This is just a sample of some of the information that we are provided at times. I also serve on the Oyster Advisory Commission to Maryland DNR and have for years. So I've sat through lots of different meetings and such that deal with who's doing what, where, the technicalities of oysters, management of them, yada, yada, yada. And ultimately, this is 2009. And so what it shows is different kinds of gear. And I'm going to show you some examples of what those gears look like and where they're harvested. So pink is sail dredge up in the northern part of the bay here. Green is power dredge. You see it mostly focused down south and a little bit in Talbot County outside of St. Michael's and Tillman Island. You have patent tongs, which are hydraulically driven tong. They're very popular in the lower Patuxent River. That's that cluster of red on the west side. Southeast corner there, that's down towards Tangier Sound, Deal Island, Crisfield. And then there's a few spots up and around Annapolis. There's also some spots in Eastern Bay. And then up on the northern portion of the bay there, that'd be Swan Point, Tolchester, Man o' War Shoal, some various spots up north. And again, this is 09. This is quite some time ago. But it does show that there are available oysters to harvest throughout the bay at times. If this were looking at 2024 harvest, you'd see it mostly centered from the middle portion, the Choptank River, the little green cluster on the right side. That's Broad Creek, the Choptank, right in the Tillman Island area. There's a lot of harvest happening. And then the southeastern portion where all the green dots are. And that's ultimately just been an evolution of where the population is strongest and where the gear is. And there's all these externalities that impact the industry as well. And so they shift based on need and opportunity for other fisheries and lots of other things. So I'll talk through the gears. And then ultimately with oysters, we talk about it as a three-legged stool. There's the wild fishery, there's aquaculture, and there is restoration. And just in general, public benefit to being out there and supporting the ecosystem. And then with Maryland aquaculture, it started in 2010. So it's a relatively new exercise, at least at the scale it's at now. But these are tongs. You can see a fleet of boats here in the top right corner. That's actually at the mouth of Broad Creek. Broad Creek is a popular both hand tong and power dredge area. The idea is that the different gears work more efficiently or less efficiently and have different impacts on the bottom. You can see the gentleman standing up on the boat. You'd want to do this in a relatively calm area, a shallow area, because you're reaching down to the bottom with those long rake-looking things, the oyster tongs, and picking up oysters. They also make them, they can pick up a single oyster, like this one in the top middle. And ultimately, these are folks you don't want to arm wrestle. Some of the strongest, hardest working people you can imagine. And ultimately, over time, before there were this idea of restoration or aquaculture, there was always conflict amongst gear. And so there are lines drawn. That's why the different color dots are in different spots. That's by regulation. And the counties try and manage themselves and rotate some of those things in working with the department, because there are county oyster committees, which ultimately manage on a local level their watermen and their relationship with DNR and advancing some of their priorities for the wild fishery. So then in the top left corner, I almost said northwest corner. In the top left corner, we have skipjacks. Of course, the iconic sail dredging boat of the Chesapeake Bay. In fact, all the images are skipjack except for the top right. So ultimately, the skipjack was built, designed here to go through shallow waters, to be able to set a sail to power a pulley dredge. You see a drawing of the dredge in the bottom middle. So the skipjack would set sail and go perpendicular to the wind and drag that dredge across the bar. They currently have a bushel limit of 100 bushels per day, so they can do pretty good to harvest a decent volume of oysters when there's the right location. They do sail dredge in the upper bay a bit, and there are regulations on what days of the week they can sail versus power dredge if they are a skipjack or a sailboat. And then in the top right corner, you see a typical Chesapeake Bay workboats with some cranes and booms hanging from them. Those folks are power dredging. They're using the similar technology, the dredge, dragging along the bottom, but using a diesel engine, which of course doesn't wear out. So many have argued that power dredging is too destructive of the bottom, knocks down the reef, and it does. Ultimately, we want an oyster reef to be about a foot deep in shell to provide the most viable habitat and most valuable habitat. And then ultimately, these do break that down. So there's a lot of debate around it. That said, when the industry finds a situation like in the bottom middle, and I see the question in the chat, I'll get to that. And yeah, keep putting questions in the chat, and I'll pause as I see them. But ultimately, this drawing right here, if you can see, it's just drawing across, coming across the oyster shells, and just imagine that those are the only oysters there. It's not a rock, it's not a reef. Ultimately, what they're doing is picking up the available oysters, stirring up the bottom, allowing that sediment to kind of go off in a plume, and cleaning up some of the shell that's been covered up. And so there's been this growth of reefs experienced by the watermen that are dredging in certain places, and they've seen an increase in abundance and therefore catchability, and their success. And so there continues to be debate around what should be allowed where and when and why, and how should it be regulated from a biomass or available catch perspective. But ultimately, all that kind of continues on. And there aren't many skipjacks at work anymore, and I think they'll continue to be less and less. They're very old boats. They're really expensive to maintain. I actually recently had one of our members ask me to try and identify a location for a skipjack for an education program, because he's looking to donate it. So anyway, really effective gear. I'm going to get through the other gears, and I'll talk about that Virginia question. At least I think I am. There we go. So this is another way of harvesting oysters, the patent tong. You can see they're hydraulically controlled. They're not terribly different in the tong technology from a hand tong, but in this case, powered winches by hydraulics, and the hydraulic boom or hydraulic grabbers of the tongs can bring up way more oysters. This gentleman right here on the right is Simon Dean, a very hardworking Southern Maryland oysterman out of the Patuxent River. He and his wife have an aquaculture facility. They do wild harvest, they do striped bass, they do education programs. She's an English teacher. And you find that in the hubs where you find the most activity, these communities that are all connected into the oyster fishery in various ways. His wife, Rachel, fishes, her cousins or brothers or grandmother or mother, everybody in the community. And so those little hubs of activity you see in harvest are always going to have those communities nearby to support. And then this is the last wild gear. This is diving. So folks actually on the top side will have a compressor that brings air down to them. So they're using a snorkel type system, but compressed air. And then they'll have warm water coming from a hot water heater shot down into a really thick wetsuit. They'll reinforce the knees, the elbows, the hands. And as you see, they'll crawl along the bottom, generally putting oysters that they pick up into a bag. That bag's going to be either connected to a float or connected to a rope, and then they tug on it, and the people on top bring it up. And then they have different bushel limits. Every single gear is going to have a different bushel limit, and that can relate to the question, is there a reason the VA regulation is higher than Maryland? And so, yeah, oysters are managed in Maryland by Maryland's rules, regs, laws, etc. And then Virginia does it different. Ultimately, Virginia advanced aquaculture about 100 years before Maryland. And so in Virginia, the way that their fishery works is they say there's, well, 125 years basically of history of who can have a least right to the bottom, and having a place to culture oysters, aquaculture, that I'm going to talk about next. They've been doing that since the early 1900s. That leads to the majority of their industry, and a lot of the things like the Chincoteague oyster. They're cultured by that community. They're not just a harvested from the wild type thing. And they've grown, and people know what they are, the Chincoteague oyster. Maryland didn't start aquaculture until 2010. And so that's one component you can compare. Virginia's harvest is way higher than Maryland's. Wild fishery, what Virginia looks at, or sorry, the way Virginia regulates their bottom is, unless it's declared open, it's not open for oyster fishing at all, because most of it's private or it's being used by other things. Maryland has areas you cannot oyster, like our sanctuaries, which includes about 24% of bay bottom, at least bay oyster bottom. Marylanders can't go there to harvest, but everything else is open. And we have a designation called a public shellfish fishery area. So in a lot of ways, harvesters can go out and find what they want where they want. So Virginia tries to utilize their wild fishery in a rotational harvest policy. So what they'll say is X number of harvesters, because they're limited by licenses, will open up a bar, allow them to power dredge, and they'll be able to work it until a certain amount of oysters are taken off of it. And that can either be monitored by the state or it's determined ahead of time. And then that bar will be closed for a couple of years, and it allows the oysters to propagate and kind of bring back the population. Maryland flirts with that a little bit in trying to implement rotational harvest regulations, but it's been very difficult. There's been some co-ops that have been set up. And in the end, I'll move to aquaculture and talk about that some more, because there's a lot of diversification happening in the industry right now, where a lot of aquaculturists are wild harvesters. Like I mentioned, Simon Dean a moment ago and his wife Rachel, they're well diversified. Then there's some folks that may work to support the aquaculture industry. So what we're looking at here is a lab growing some algae. There's a lot of different scientific investment happening at the university level, and working in partnership with farms like this particular one down in Hooper Island, to develop the right algae that can feed oysters at the right rate to maximize their growth, their health, their growth rates, how they're shaped, all sorts of different things based on what we're feeding them, and then the environment you're putting the oyster in. So what we're viewing here is cage aquaculture. And so oysters will be put into cages, placed out onto the bay bottom. There's a float, looks like a crab float, and folks will go out in vessels like this one on the bottom right and pick them up, clean the cages up, resize them, put them back out, take what they're going to harvest, and culture or work their oyster beds. And so the cage cultures of the least common actual use in Maryland, but here's a drawing of that. And on the right, I'm sorry, float culture is the least used. Cage culture is just behind it, and the vast majority of bottom looks just like a native oyster reef, like this one in the bottom right. I'm sorry, bottom middle. That's just an image of an underwater reef, and actually that's actually from the Little Choptank River. But ultimately, on bottom aquaculture is the most popular, and it's partly because when you have a lease, in the way the regs work with DNR, you have to maintain a certain density of oysters on that lease, and then ultimately you can harvest it in different ways, and most of them would use a power dredge because it works quickly and effectively, and they're their oysters that they keep planting at a certain density to keep that lease. And yes, you did hear me right. 2010 is when the current aquaculture rules were put in place. There was aquaculture, but it was not nearly as advanced as it is now. There were lease bottoms. It was very, very antiquated system. Now there's an entire division. They're very slow in their ability to manage the number of applications and the growth of the industry. There's been some headaches there, but the department, DNR, does oversee the permitting and management of the aquaculture division, and it is growing drastically. So in fact, tomorrow I'm picking up oysters from Shore Thing Shellfish from St. Mary's County. down in Annapolis, and we help them do group buys of oysters, and you get wholesale rates, and you get bags of 50 or 100 straight from the oyster farmer, and we generally do it around the holidays. So I'll get you all on that list for the future, because we do them around Baltimore as well. We'll do a one friend does a pickup up in Butler, another friend does one over in Essex, and we just like to promote and connect with these oyster farmers, because for us, for me personally, this is my preferred oyster. I know it's a positive every step of the way to the Chesapeake. It's not taking the wild resource. I'm not combative and disrespectful to those that harvest the wild resource. It is legal. It is allowed. I meet the policies where the policies are made, and don't discourage anybody from, there's nothing wrong with the wild harvest of our oysters. We've been able to balance it and see some positive trajectory, and it's a very important component of Maryland's culture, history, and current economy. So there's balance that we have to find. These floats for aquaculture are the least popular, of course, because the view shed interruption. The cages have a lot of maintenance costs. They have a lot of gear. They have a lot of interaction with boats at times, with the floats and such that have to be used to mark them. So with every industry, there's growth. There's a lot of spike in excitement getting into the industry, but in the end, it's all rolled back. A lot of it's rolled back to that on-bottom aquaculture, because that's just easier. Yes, True Chesapeake Restaurant in Baltimore does their own aquaculture. They're friends of ours. We're all part of something right now called the Chesapeake Oyster Alliance, which the Chesapeake Bay Foundation led, and it's trying to advance aquaculture and support the industry, as well as restore more oysters into the bay. The Hudsons, which own True Chesapeake, have a oyster farm down on St. Jerome Creek, which is down in fact, I think that's where this float picture is from. It's down in St. Mary's County on the bay side. It's the first tributary coming up from Point Lookout on the bay, a small little creek there. And they have fantastic oysters, in their restaurant here at Whitehall Mill, just down the hill by South of Union and Woodbury, is fantastic. I highly recommend you go and check it out. It's a beautiful facility. I actually helped write legislation to support, to help them solve a problem they're having with their oyster farm. They have their tumbler, which is a unit that I can't believe I don't have a picture of it, but it's a tumbling cylinder with different size holes, and it has water jets spraying in it. And so the oysters go in it, it tumbles, it sorts them, cleans them, and drops them into different totes. Well, that piece of equipment has been mounted on the dock at True Chesapeake Oyster Farm since its inception. And about 8-10 years in, they started getting letters from the MDE inspector saying they needed to apply for a permit, and that it was prohibited to have that on the dock, when a whole other piece of regulation said no, it was allowed, and it was approved through Maryland DNR, and they were asking to have it grandfathered. So anyway, we wrote legislation. We talked to our local representatives, went down to Annapolis, and got the problem solved for that restaurant. So they're great friends. Yes, they do partner with Jay Fleming. That bottom middle picture is Jay Fleming's, and tomorrow morning, little secret, I'm going fishing with Jay for the first couple hours of the day. So it's going to be fun. In fact, some more of these pictures are Jay's. Restoring oysters is the next piece of the puzzle here. And it's hard to see because it's zoomed out, but all these little black line and polygons you see on the left map are those Yates bars that I spoke of earlier. The green is the area that is covered by oyster sanctuary, where harvest cannot occur. Oh, that's fantastic. I see you went to Tangerine Smith. That's great. Yeah, Jay's been a good friend of mine for quite some time. This picture is Jay's as well in the middle. That's actually granite, which was put down in one of the sanctuaries, and those are oysters attaching to it. And so in the Oyster Sanctuary program, which also began in 2010, this creek right here, which is in between, that's Harris Creek. It's just east of Tillman Island. St. Michael's is about right here where my cursor is, and then east and off here. So the Tread Avon River, the Harris Creek, the Little Chop Tank, and portions of the Chop Tank were all closed for sanctuary. And then some of these other areas. The St. Mary's was invested in as a sanctuary priority. Harris Creek was, and Little Chop Tank were, as well as the Minokan River down here. And then, gosh, what's the last one? I'm having a dumb attack. 1, 2, 3, 4. Oh, that's all 5. There's 5 that have been restored up until now, and there's 5 more that have been identified for future restoration. So this just some images of what restoration looks like. On the bottom right is actually a limestone mine in the panhandle of Florida. And what it picked up is that top right image, or what we got out of it is that top image. Those are fossilized, not quite, I don't know if they're fossilized, but they're oyster shells that came out of this limestone pit, were brought up here by train, actually funded to the tune of $250,000 by a private individual to be placed in a little chop tank. I'm not sure that this is an image of exactly that material, but you can see the sediment plume that comes off as they place this material. When this limestone Florida material was put in, it upset a lot of people because they said there was mud and other things that they didn't want in the Chesapeake. And so that project was actually stopped. Point is, there's lots of different ways to restore oysters. And as we were talking about oyster shell earlier, oyster shell is the number one thing. And that's why we have the Oyster Recovery Partnership. That's why we have the idea that we're recycling. And it's kind of hard to see here, but we're taking the oysters, we take them to a restaurant, they should be stored in a pile, let age for the recycling process to work, and then they go out on a restoration barge to restore the reef. This happens on a massive scale. This pile right here in the bottom middle here is actually part of it's sitting at the Graysonville, Maryland dump on the Eastern Shore. We have a series of reefs that we build that I'll be jumping in to show you quickly because I know I'm going long on time. But ultimately, shell is so important. And I just served on a task force Governor Moore created called the Shell and Substrate Task Force to bring stakeholders and the agency together to try and identify better sources of shell. We're now actually shipping shell in from the West Coast, thanks to some people that have put together an investment to see if it would work, and it does. And so it's a different species of oyster, but it is basically the same thing, and it's been sitting out long enough where no pathogens or any other potential impactful things can exist on those shells, and they've all been tested and approved through import permits. So lots of shell is coming to the bay because we ultimately never bring it back because we don't capture it all. So what do you do with it? You recycle it, you let it age. Oyster Recovery Partnership in this their lab at Horn Point that the University of Maryland runs. That's what this is right here. These are tanks that are called spat setting tanks. These are used to place shell into in these massive cages. The shell has been aged, it's been cleaned, it's been they shake it to get all the sand and fines off of it. And then ultimately they're introducing the baby oysters. In the bottom right-hand corner are mom and dad. So these are tanks that are brought in to have the right temperature and salinity of water. They're broodstock oysters that come from all over the bay and mix and match to get different genetics. And then ultimately mom and dad do the thing. The baby oysters meet in the water column, and they then get introduced to the tanks. In the tanks, they attach to the shell in the tanks, and then deployed by their vessel here that you see, where they largely shoot the spat-on shell, as it's called, spat being a baby oyster, off into the water using a water cannon. And this is just a map of Harris Creek, and some of those small little different color polygons are the spots where different restoration approaches were done for that sanctuary. And it's met all of its goals. The sanctuary goals were to have ultimately a 50 oyster per square meter density to be considered restored. And this is why, one of the reasons. So we talked about ecosystem services. I just pressed play on this video. These are two identical tanks. I hope you've seen this before. It's pretty popular display. We often set this up at shows, or we set it up at schools sometimes so the students can measure the different clarity changes that happen throughout the day. You can see times going by quickly on that clock there. And ultimately what the oysters are doing is filtering that water, eating the algae, which is the greenish brown you see in the left tank. So left tank had no oysters, right tank did. Voila, the water is clear. And then ultimately, here is a video that explains the mom and dad oyster thing I was just talking about. So here they are, 1 day old. This is under a microscope, of course. They're moving around. They have two shells already. You can see that one on its side. You'll see the cilia sticking out. That's what they're swimming around with. So these are spat or larvae. I think technically they become spat when they're ready to attach, which will happen in a couple days here. So they're getting bigger. They're starting to get a little more oblong shape. At this point, they're always going to be in a water that's the right condition, right? Temperature, salinity, has food in it. So in the hatchery settings, they are fed algae, like that lab I showed earlier. Here they are at 10 days old. They're just a couple days away from being ready to attach. You can see they're getting more complex internally. All the different organs and stuff are forming. See some movement in there. Now those triangles are actually shell chips. So you'll see at 2 weeks old, they're starting to crawl. Out in the water, they'd be floating around for these 2-week period, and then ultimately trying to cling to their fellow oyster reef. Not necessarily the one they came from, most likely one nearby. There's different studies that have shown that spat may go to the bottom during low tide or outgoing tides and stay to the top on incoming tides. We don't know for sure. There's one thing we cannot track. We cannot really track the genetics of where they go and how they go, or mark them in any way. But you'll see a model here next. This is a model done by a scientist back in 2010 when a lot of different research was being done on how to bring things back. How do we do sanctuaries? How do we do wild harvest, restoration, et cetera? After that low in the industry in '03. And this is by Dr. Elizabeth North. So I'm going to press play. You'll notice the day count goes up. This is based on prevailing meteorological and tide data. And so it is a specific date period back in June of 2010. So across the 2-week period, all these spat are believed to be able to travel all throughout the Choptank watershed here. The green ones have lived. The blue ones were trying to find a home and couldn't. Now they turned a different color, orangish, and they're probably dead. And that's just kind of saying, all right, there's substrate out in these places that these animals could attach to. They're born up here in Harris Creek where we're trying to get a nice super density of moms and dads that we don't harvest. Maybe the spat will go out all over the place. There's a really heavy right here is Broad Creek. This is where there's power dredging and hand tonguing. So the idea was if spat from here can go over to here, everybody wins. There's endless debate about whether it worked or if it works and if it not, but there's really good harvest happening right in Broad Creek. There's a lot of oysters in Harris Creek. I see it as a win-win, but there's continued debate that will never end with local perspectives versus science versus kind of the Maryland or global kind of perspectives. So there's Pearl with Morgan State, and does Horn Point and Pearl do much joint research? I'm not sure about joint research. We work with both of them. We have a fellowship program which began with Morgan at the Pearl lab level. We do some partnership events with them throughout the year. We have an outreach consultant that is a Morgan grad that we met through the fellowship program who works for us. And with them being here in Baltimore, we're looking to engage in some more work there. They're actually bringing on an undergrad program for estuarine science and policy. So it kind of lands squarely in what I get to do every day. And so we're looking to hopefully add somebody part-time this year to one of their undergrad students. So there's tons of stuff that we barely scratch the surface as an organization in supporting some of this great work. And I'm going to jump real quick into some of the work we do. So I don't want to go too much longer. I'm going to fly through some SPAT data. This is SPAT set, something that Maryland DNR observes through surveys throughout the year, or year after year, pardon me. They do a fall survey to look at SPAT set and disease prevalence and various other things throughout the Bay. And as you can see, just what this should show you is that there's periods of higher, well above average SPAT set. And then more recently, we've had some uptick after some low periods. And you can see during this low harvest period, like '03, well, there wasn't a very high biomass of adults left because harvest crashed. And it kind of makes sense that there's not a lot of spat. There's not a lot of adults. That kind of happened through this period as well. Spat set's impacted by salinity, temperature variation once the animals are out in the water column across those 2 weeks, and lots of other things that a lot of research is being done on. Here's just a comparison 2022 to 23. Red is the good thing here. It's a higher density of spat per bushel. Bushel being just the measure of volume of shell in this case. And so you saw the lower Potomac saw a major increase. We mentioned True Chesapeake, their oyster farms right here on the St. Mary's County shoreline. We just deployed 600 reef balls in the upper St. Mary's sanctuary this year. So hopefully they're covered in spat. And what is the reef ball program? So I'm going to jump into what we do to make our impact on habitat. And I've only got a couple more slides here. What you see on the left here, of course, is a map of the Chesapeake Bay. It's hard to read them, but all these little dots are spots that are called Maryland Artificial Reef Initiative sites. So on the right here is the day that the Maryland Artificial Reef Initiative was formally created as a partnership between DNR and Coastal Conservation Association. We are the fiscal agent for the reef program for the state. So DNR has committed to support a full-time position to coordinate reef deployment. Oh, there goes that timer again. And ultimately, this is a group of folks, many of which I've been honored to still work with, and unfortunately, a few that aren't with us anymore that have really put the hard work together and saw the vision that if we bring recreational fishing, a nonprofit with the state, we can streamline reef building, give them the tools to do it on their own, and that's the work I get to do in our habitat program. So that was, gosh, what year was that? '07, I believe, is this picture here. And so ultimately, part of my day-to-day is managing with the state, with the DNR official and a committee of people, which one of these reefs we prioritize. Yesterday, we deployed one at Hollicott's Noose, right up here in Eastern Bay at the southern end of Kent Island. In October, we did some at Chesapeake Beach, right here off, I guess that's southern Anne Arundel County, right on the edge of Calvert County there. And then what else? I mentioned the St. Mary's. It's not a Maury site, but in the upper reaches just past the college, we worked with Chesapeake Bay Foundation and deployed 600 reef balls there, 300 of which were covered in spat before they went in the water. And so what is a reef ball? Well, our program is called the Living Reef Action Campaign, and this logo in the top left was actually designed by students at the onset of the program in 2015. So next year is our 10-year anniversary for this program. We built a reef ball. They're an engineered structure that you see on the bottom left here. They're made by having a mold, which you see on the bottom right, and you're going to see a lot more pictures of those. And ultimately, we bring people together, put the parts together, mix the concrete, pour it in the mold. The next day, remove the mold, and you end up with that reef structure. Right here is one that had gosh, I think this was 10 months of growth from spat up to the size oysters you see there. Those are probably 1.5 to 2 inches, 1.5 inches mostly on average. And we counted that there's 1,500 oysters on this reef ball that you're looking at. And so we call it the Living Reef Action Campaign because building artificial reefs has been a long-standing thing that recreational fishing groups have done and lots of people have done throughout the world. But reef balls were designed in 1992 to be specifically designed to provide beneficial habitat inside the ball, outside the ball, around it. They're designed to allow current to flow through and ultimately create three-dimensional relief, which is what the oyster reef once created as well. But now, unfortunately, they're so degraded in most places, we don't have three-dimensionality because it ultimately takes 100 plus years for multiple generations of oysters to grow on top of each other and not be removed in order to get that relief that the reef ball can create. So ultimately, here's what a reef ball build looks like. Some of the folks working with us in the top left corner is my favorite part of anything I've done at CCA. I was at the Masonry Tech Center in Westminster working with some of our students there, and I walked down the hallway, and out popped a teacher wearing a tutu into the hallway, and I caught up to her, never been shy, so I said, hi, I like your tutu. Start talking to her. She said, oh, who are you? I said, I'm the reef guy. Oh, gosh, I almost hit one with my car this morning in the parking lot. I wasn't paying attention. She and I are going back and forth. We end up at the office together where I was headed. And I said, ma'am, I come to find out she manages the fashion and textile division at the Career and Tech Center in Westminster. And she ultimately took on the challenge of building us a reef ball costume. So that's what this lady's wearing in this sense right here. She delivered it to us after she and her students built it with 3 weeks notice ahead of the Oyster Stroll, which is the second Saturday in October, which is an event that the town of Westminster hosts for us, where the entire street's shut down. We invite oyster farmers from all throughout the bay, and you walk around, drink beer, eat oysters, listen to music, do arts and crafts, sometimes build reef balls. And that year in 2018, I got to get that costume for the first time and wear it proudly. We have a volunteer that was on the Baltimore News a couple weeks ago wearing it as well. So I'm fortunate that I get to have some fun with my job like that and teach people different things in different ways. But ultimately, what you're seeing here is a reef ball build. We do these throughout the state. We have 2 trailers. We're funding a 3rd trailer at this point on the Eastern Shore, or we're under a campaign to fundraise for it. We're not there yet. And what that does is it houses the equipment that you see here. We spread out in places like the Bush River Yacht Club in the top right corner. This is Robert Moten Elementary in the top left corner. And then the reef ball out in the middle here this is actually after a couple of years of growth at the Tillman Island Reef site, which you're going to see an underwater video of in a moment. Oh, and then ultimately this is making a reef ball. We fill the mold with concrete. These buoys inside create the voids that end up getting the holes on the outside of the reef ball when you're finished. And on day 2, we take them apart, put everything back in the trailer, and haul the reef balls to a storage site where they'll eventually go in the water. One of these oysters, this oyster right here is being held by a scientist that was doing work on this reef ball, and that's about a 5-inch oyster right there. And again, I think it's 5 or 6 years old. So we see great growth rates on our reef balls. And here's what they look like underwater. This is 14 months after the deployment of these. So we deployed them in 2016, and this is in 2017. These are divers from Stevenson University that were doing an abundance and reef study to see before and after deployment what sort of biomass of different animals could they observe, or at least abundance. And so they did these videos. This is August. The reason the water is so green is all of the algae, which is in the water during the warm water months. You'll see the little small cracks on the oyster. That's them open and feeding. That was a striped blending, I believe, that swam away. And so you can see that was down the side of a reef ball. Here's a jellyfish also grazing on algae. Dr. Keith Johnson was the lead of this work and gave us this video. That's who Dr. Johnson is. And then so you can see just the amazing density of oysters on a reef ball. And so this is something that nature, I mean, of course, they're a natural animal, but we've jump-started their ability to do this. These are the hatchery-reared spat. They came out of tanks similar to the ones you saw previously. In fact, in 2 slides, you'll see a boat that we deploy them with. And ultimately, we get this amazing super density, which leads to life. There's crabs spawning, and then ultimately hiding, from the structure. There's an anemone, barnacles, all these things that filter water. We also place some reef balls here as an analysis side by side with.
Hey, excuse me, sir.
Yes.
Is lava? What color is the lava that baby oysters are?
So I think I'll show you. Watch. Remember this? Did you see this video? So
Yeah.
there you go. There's some baby oysters right there. So see, they're kind of clear, and then they have that little darker spot. That dark spot is actually something where they're going to squirt out a little bit of glue, and they get to stick to those other things that you see. Those are chips of little seashells, oyster shells. So that's a tiny little baby oyster. So they're see-through at first, but then as soon as they grow and they get out into the water, they'll start to look kind of browns and greens and different colors like you see in this video. And the reason it's so green underwater is there's plants floating around in the water. And so on this reef ball, there's no oysters yet, but we put this in the water without them. So this is just concrete, and you can see some of the animals that there's algae and other things that attach. They'll be
underground.
Yeah, that's underwater.
But I mean underwater.
Yeah. So here's another picture of some of the baby oysters. They're hard to see, but they're some of the little spots up here in the top right. Like that's baby oyster. That's a baby oyster. They're kind of brown or maroon when they're really small. These are the tanks that we put them in. We put the reef balls on top of this boat, and then ultimately the boat goes out and drops the reef balls about 3 at a time. Here's another picture of a reef deployment. This is a great story of how the Living Reef Action Campaign works. This gentleman in the bottom right, his name is Brian Sheets. He has a contracting company called Straight Edge Construction down in Salisbury. And during the pandemic in 2020, he reached out because he said, is there anything I can do to help? I understand your programs aren't really running. I want to build some reef balls and I want to use my construction crew. So I brought the trailer down to his house in Salisbury. This is in October of 2020. Of course, we're outside. We could space out. We did a reef ball build, and we built 15 of them that day. He kept the trailer for the next couple months, worked with friends, neighbors, churches. They ended up building 120 reef balls, which went on a barge. A different type of reef unit we use is called a pyramid. That's the triangle shaped ones. These are actually made with leftover concrete in construction yards. So it's not wasted. It goes into a specialized mold. The construction workers will strip the mold, give us the pyramids, and they deliver them to us for free. A company up in York, Pennsylvania called Kinsley Construction delivers them 250 at a time to our waiting barges so we can put them in the water. They do a similar job to a reef ball. And so Brian helped us get this reef going. This is down in Crisfield, Maryland, just in Tangier Sound. Smith Island's on the left side there of that image. And then we also did a bigger reef down there thanks to Brian's help, and he caught this red drum. On the first day, I told him he better go fishing at his reef because he had never gone out there, but helped us build it. So since 2021, we've had 4 deployments at Janes Island, and this image is actually the biggest deployment we've ever done. As you can see, that's real equipment, big stuff. Those are 220 student-made reef balls and then 770 pyramids. And then you'll see at the far end some pipe. These were miscast by the concrete yard, so they're brand new, they're clean, and we're able to put these at some of the reef sites too. Every reef site has a permit. You can see the square here on the bottom middle. That's a permitted site that's overseen by the Maryland Department of Environment, but also DNR, Corps of Engineers. There's a historical society component of reviewing reef permit applications. And ultimately what we're saying under this public trust concept is, okay, this area of the bottom, which is public, can be used for this purpose. And of course, this purpose that we're using it for is public benefit. Even though some people do disagree with the concrete being used to go into the bay. Of course, concrete is limestone. Limestone is old shell. there is a chemical component, but what we do is allow the pH to balance by letting them completely cure on land for generally 3 months, if not longer. And there's no negative impact to the bay whatsoever by the stone, sand, Portland cement, and water as cured concrete going back in. And so ultimately, this is a big sandy, kind of muddy bottom. Again, the wide expanse of Tangier Sound. If you've never been to Crisfield and taken the ferry to Smith Island, please do. Tangier Island as well. They're beautiful places that won't be there forever. So this is this company that did this work did a lot of the fine layering of material in oyster sanctuaries. So they're really experts at layering out substrate, and that's why we hired them. On this piece of equipment, it's a long reach excavator. It can reach nearly to the bottom. And it has a GPS equipment and software that gives us this plot out on the right. And so every one of those squares is when they dropped a cluster of pyramids or reef balls. And you can see the arcs because the machine swings in an arc as it swings its arm. And then the barge will lift up these various poles and swing the barge as well. Inside this orange bar, this yellowish box here is actually the office. I was in there doing emails when this picture was taken, but we had Wi-Fi out there as we deployed this reef. This took 2 days to get in the water. In the top right corner is just an example of our tech center program. That's actually a high school down in Salisbury, Parkside High School. Them and Queen Anne County High School for a little bit, and then Westminster Career and Tech now for 10 years have built the larger size reef ball that we build, which is about 300 pounds that you've seen a couple pictures of. What we build with the students is about 220 pounds. Here's some more images of the Chesapeake Beach Reef. We've done 2 deployments there, one this past year, and then one a couple years back in 21. And then here is the St. Mary's project I spoke of. The green blob down here in the bottom right of the map is where the college is. There's a shoreline college reef right there we've supported for many years, and this image in the bottom right is from that. That is one you can actually snorkel out to. Parking's a little tricky, but you can walk on that beach. It is public. It is there's a little beach right there with the sailing center at St. Mary's College, and it's gorgeous. I highly recommend checking it out. And those reef balls are in clusters throughout there, and that site is led by the St. Mary's River Watershed Association. In the
Dave,
yes,
this is Steve King,
hey, Steve.
down in St. Mary's County.
Sir.
The reef that you're talking about was the first half acre was constructed in 2011. So I'm sorry, 2013. That reef is now 11 years old. Mm-hmm. And the difference between that reef and the other reef ball reefs at the bay is that reef was constructed with a full water column permit.
Right.
Those reefs there are 4 feet high and 5 feet of water at mean low tide. And they were intended to represent the way oysters used to grow throughout the bay prior to 1865, when the state of Maryland and Virginia repealed their prohibition on dredging. Mm-hmm. That's when the destruction of about 218,000 acres of these fully vertical, full water column reefs began. Emma Green, I think you know Emma Green and Cassie Gervais.
Yep. Dr.
Gervais. Emma did a monitoring study of that reef in 2022 and 2023, and the results are available now. The average density over the 5 acres, some of which is fully vertical or fully 3-dimensional, some of it's on the bottom, but the average density was 244.7 oysters per square meter. Of 122 sample sites, only one was on the vertical reef portion. That was that sample was 1,200 oysters per square meter. And
the magic of the reef ball in 3-dimensionality. The magic of the reef ball in 3-dimensionality.
Yeah, well, some of these half of the first half acre was reef ball.
Yeah.
The other half was aggregate rubble reef.
Yep.
Because this project was initiated by Rotary International District 7620, and they funded the first part of that project. And the idea was to try to demonstrate what having a vertical surface would do in terms of oyster recruitment and survival. And as far as I know, at least within the Chesapeake, I mean the Maryland portion of Chesapeake, it's the only fully three-dimensional reef. In other words, the only one that's almost a full water column. Eventually, those reefs will grow out of the water. In fact, if you were down driving past the reef last week during the real low tide, you could see the tops of these reefs poking out of the water.
Yeah, I saw those pictures online, and the same thing happened. There's actually a similar reef with a little bit longer history, but not the results. Up at the Chesapeake Bay Environmental Center, and that's where I was working this week to try and add to that shoreline there. But yeah, the blowout tide that happened, gosh, last Friday and last Monday, I think, or Wednesday was amazing.
Yeah.
And that's where
here's my concern, Dave. In 2011, the Maryland Department of Natural Resources commissioned a survey, and they found that 0.3% of the oysters that were here in 1865 are still in the bay. So if we're going to try to restore it, let me back up. I think it was Dr. Gene Cronin over at the Chesapeake Bay Biological Laboratory years ago. He estimated that there were so many oysters in the bay when those historic reefs, three-dimensional reefs, existed. They filtered the entire volume of the bay every 3 days. In other words, they ate all the algae basically every 3 days. Now that we have 0.3% of those oysters here, because those vertical reefs were all mined to the bottom basically by the early part of the 1900s, that filtration, I mean, we're lucky if we get 1 day a year that filtration takes place. And that's like taking a swimming pool and turning the filter on, 1 day a year and expecting that it's not going to be full of algae. Just not going to happen. So,
hey, Steve, Steve, can you hold off on? We're gonna let David finish up the presentation for folks that are on here, and then we can continue the conversation after.
Sure.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
So the boat here you see is the Patricia Campbell, the Chesapeake Bay Foundation's oyster restoration vessel, and this is in the St. Mary's. This is where we put this triangle right here, on just past Horseshoe Bend is where we put 600 reef balls this year. Half have spat on them, half do not. The idea being the jumpstart of first generation, but this area is, as you just heard, is full of high density and good recruitment and spawning of oysters. Of course, it's going to be variable no matter where you look, and all the different complexities of oysters are variable depending how you choose to look at the different metrics, kind of like what you've been hearing just now. The filtration capacity, all those types of things vary in different places. But ultimately, every single reef ball we build and put in the water is a three-dimensional reef of its own. Reaching to the water to the surface is great in some areas, but really not viable in other areas, just given the use and the fact that there's millions of us here now that need to figure out how to share this bay. This is one of my favorite projects. This is actually a side scan sonar of reef balls that were deployed in I think 21, January of 21, in a spot in the Magathie. It may have been 22. The Noah's Reef is actually named after a young man who unfortunately is no longer with us. He ended his own life, and we honored him in working with his family and crisis managers and such in community to do a big reef ball build in Cape St. Clair community. And so those reef balls were put out near Dobbins Island in the Magathie River in partnership with the Magathie River Association. McGuire Marine Construction, a local contractor, helped support the deployment now three different times. And so we started it with this 100 reef ball grid before it was called Noah's Reef. The second load is right here in this image with the folks sitting against the machine there. it's hard to see, but most of those are high school students, and every single one of the high school students is a young lady. There's some volunteers here from the local community, and then McGuire's team is standing there as well. On this barge is 175 reef balls. The majority of them weighing 225 pounds. Those 7 ladies came 2 days in a row and moved the reef balls one at a time down a skinny dock to get them to the barge, because the marina we were allowed to store at wasn't big enough for the barge to reach land. And so they came out and volunteered, and we had a pizza party, and they all got sweatshirts and gear and everything, and were just fantastic. One of the young ladies is actually driving the machine right there in that picture. So our program, working with elementary school students throughout the schools, I didn't really speak to it yet, but we ultimately work with every single 5th grader in Calvert County right now, about 60% of Carroll County 4th graders, and then periodically throughout the different portions of the state, depending on our capacity and various support. But ultimately, we worked with Broadneck High School, and that's where these young ladies are from, down in Arnold and Cape St. Clair area. So there's a map of where Dobbins Island is in the Magathie. This is the north side of the Magathie. And this is what Noah's Reef looks like after year 2, after we determined that it was Noah's Reef. The original grid is the smaller one of the two, and so we put out a second grid there, and you'll see on the left, it looks like a Z, but it's actually an N for Noah. And we are now adding an OA and an H. We got our 3rd deployment in earlier this year in May, without adding the O, so we have 2 letters to spell next time. But we've beat the majority of the reef balls that were built to put at this reef are being built in Carroll County. I saw a question earlier. We're building about 250 reef balls in the elementary school program, and we have 2 of those, so about 500 per year with those programs. And then ultimately, I just added up. I didn't quite add up our totals for this year today. I was working on it, and I don't quite have it finished, but it's roughly around 30 reef ball builds are what we accomplished this year, building 18 to 20 per. We had 34 reef ball builds in 2023, and so that's 68 days in the field working, and then all the prep ahead of prep after, and then ultimately getting it in the water. I mentioned earlier, I put a reef in yesterday. So it was not me, it was McGuire Marine on this very same barge in a scene that looks just like what you see right here. It was put into Eastern Bay, and I'll ask all of you to sign up for our newsletter and follow us on all the different social and stuff, to keep an eye on what we're doing, because you'll be able to see, all of our updates and all of the programming and opportunities to get involved. But ultimately, when it comes down to it, it's all about clean water. I saw somebody say, there it is, reef balls will also increase habitat for juvenile black sea bass. That is absolutely right. Black sea bass, of course. Now there's one in the picture, top middle, and that is against a reef ball at Cook's Point in the Choptank River. That sea bass happens to be an adult and actually of keeper size. That was about a 16-incher. This is a pretty famous picture taken by a diver for the Maryland Artificial Reef Initiative years ago, to highlight the success of the Cook's Point Reef, which is also called the Clint Waters Reef. We're waiting for that permit to be renewed so we can place about 200 reef balls there as soon as we can in 2025. I've been waiting for MDE to complete that permit for 3 years. But as you saw earlier, the structures provide support for the iconic blue crab. We need, they like to hide in these places as well. The clearer the water, the more grasses grow. The more grasses, the more places that juvenile fish and crabs can hide, and the system all works better. I of course have to show off one of the bigger striped bass I've caught in Maryland. That's a 44-inch female striped bass caught in February of many years ago. My beard is more gray now, and ultimately that's a female. We want to let them go. We want to maintain them. We want to conserve them. And that's a big part of the job I have at the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission. And a healthy Chesapeake Bay with better habitat, better clean water, better filtration capacity, all those things can breed more striped bass, because of a recent study that was done, did 5,000 DNA samples from fish. So they clipped the fins of 5,000 fish that were caught and analyzed their DNA and found 80% of them to be of Chesapeake Bay origin. And so all of our rivers, all of our areas that striped bass spawn every spring are important. And then being able to rear striped bass, because the majority of them, like the one in the bottom right-hand corner, that's about a three-year-old fish or so. They're going to live here until they're 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, depending on if they're male, female, and how things go. But ultimately, they were born here. And so the health of our rivers is paramount to make sure that that fish is successful. And ultimately, they drive massive fishery on the Atlantic coast. That's the biggest one that exists for recreational fishing. So that's kind of what drives us to do the work. Of course, like I said earlier, habitat today, fish tomorrow. And what we can add is always going to be beneficial. And of course, adding oysters to it is going to greatly help as well. So that was my last slide. And there's my direct contact information and our Instagram and YouTube and Facebook and website as well. And we are a membership organization. We're organized in local chapters. We have a Greater Baltimore chapter that, as I mentioned earlier, just had its fundraiser in December at Union. The chapters have local events like Angler Night Outs. Anglers Night Out is one thing we call it, where people come together for a speaker, for an educational thing, for a hands-on activity. Sometimes like tying flies or preparing your gear, or lots of different things that we can do. And it's one of those things where I get asked all the time, well, hey, let me know if you want to do something together. I do. My job is directly connected to the public resource that belongs to each and every one of you. And if it's a matter of making sure that it's there on your plate because you can buy it at your local purveyor or a waterman, that's success. If you can go out and catch it yourself, that's success as well. You can recreationally oyster, but there's a lot of complexity as to where you can. So, there's a lot of knowledge to be learned across seafood and what your options are. And unfortunately, we have a declining trend that's been going on since the Magnuson-Stevens Act was signed into law in 1976. At that time, the United States imported about 25% of its seafood that it consumed in 1977. Now we import about 91% of the seafood we consume. So oysters this year just got back onto the top 10 list, and the vast majority of them are going to be grown local and drive local economy. So they're the top 10 consumed seafood in the U.S. In the last year. And so let's keep that going. Let's keep them moving in the right direction. They're full of vitamins, minerals. They're great for you. And the last thing I'll say about it, and then I'll shut up and answer some questions, is thanks to aquaculture, oysters are available 365 days a year. Prior to that, oysters were not eaten in the summertime, largely because of, first, refrigeration, and the fact that the warmer it is, the higher the bacteria and potential viruses that can be in the oysters. And ultimately, people can get sick. Well, also, starting in about March, as they start to wake up from their wintertime slumber, oysters develop their gonad. They can change and have a male part or a female part, depending on what year it is and what the conditions are. They can do that a couple times in their life. And ultimately, the gonad is something you don't want to eat. So an oyster is not palatable really in the summertime. And that's a big component of why they weren't eaten in the summertime. The fat, the beautiful full shell, is because it's cold. And that's what you get in the wintertime when the oysters are not spawning. They've now gotten rid of the gonad, all the spawning stuff's done, and they're just a big old fat sack of protein filtering the bay. And of course, like I said a moment ago, you have to know where you're getting them from, because there is risk depending on what happens. So.
Well, thank you, Dick. Can you unshare? We'll put a spotlight on you. We'll do some Q&A. That was a fabulous presentation, and let's spotlight on you. Couple of questions that are in the chat box. Grace says, do you have, how many have you deployed? Is there a goal? How many do you want to get out there? And do they interfere? Do the balls interfere with the harvest, or are they destroyed when they're harvesting areas, or are there no overlap?
So we try and have no overlap. That is our goal. And that's part of the permitting process on that, to make sure that at least we're allowed to place them where they are. Typically, in some cases, oyster harvest can occur in those zones. The underwater video, that actually is in a place where you could harvest them. But ultimately, a lot of times the oysters that will grow on a reef ball are what we call snappy, because they'll grow long and skinny. And they grow quickly because they're at a high density. And so it's kind of like trees in a forest, like the tall, skinny poplar trees get all the light, right? And that changes the dynamic of the system. The oysters do the same thing, and they're just called snappy oysters. You find them along shorelines. You find them, Chincoteague oysters grow that way in a lot of their rocks. So they're not marketable, is my point. Generally speaking, a harvester is not going to want to complicate their day in any way. They're not going to want to put their dredge into a reef ball. So 220 to 350, they're even bigger. They make them as big as, I think, 8 to 10,000 pounds. And they're going to want to avoid them. That's one thing. Trot liners are those that do not like them, and trot lining for crabs, because their lines can get snagged. fact, they don't like anything snaggy. They prefer somewhat of a featureless bottom. But it's all a trade-off. We have to have this three-dimensionality to have the habitat to produce the biomass of animals for them to benefit from. And often there's just that difference of perspective that happens. And that's where the conflict comes from. I also mentioned earlier that some people don't like the idea of concrete going in the bay. And a lot of the conflict around substrate and the task force I served on is that, oh, we should only put shell in the water. We should only put shell in the water. And you keep hearing certain wild harvesters will say, we produce all the shell, we're great. And it's like, well, wait, where'd the shell end up? Unless it ends up back in the bay's not winning, and we have to find a policy to change that. So unfortunately with Maryland and our harvest, as it declined the second time, kind of like 70s, 80s, and since then we've lost our shucking capacity in the state. So when the oysters are processed, the shell, of course, is a byproduct. It used to be that they were in all the different local communities, Solomons, Tillman, Hoopers, Crisfield, Kent Narrows, Annapolis, Shady Side, you name it, they all had them. And ultimately the shell pile stayed there and could go back there. Now most of our oysters are going down to Virginia and being shucked by a company called Bevan's Oysters. They have private beds throughout Virginia, so you can guess where the Maryland shell ends up when Bevan's is done buying that entire animal. There's also situations when the Gulf oyster populations collapsed a couple times recently where Maryland harvest oysters go in tractor trailers to Louisiana to be shucked, then be processed into whatever market they're going into, and you can guarantee that shell never comes back. So there's a lot of complexity there, which leads to debate, but ultimately nobody's stopped us yet from doing the work we're doing, and we don't see the negative impact that some other harvesters may see. It's a big bay with plenty of room, in my view. And ultimately, number-wise, we're at about the 5,000 mark constructed. You can actually see our reef balls on Google Earth. If you go to the Graysonville dump transfer station, they're sitting amongst the oyster shell pile. One of the projects we were able to launch right before the pandemic was through highway mitigation dollars going to the reef fund to test out mitigation dollars supporting habitat uplift or sediment control through a shoreline project or a reef project. And so the reef I deployed yesterday was partially funded by those funds. And the other remaining reef balls that are sitting on land are going to go to likely protect Eastern Neck Island Wildlife Refuge at the mouth of the Chester, and then a couple other spots in the Mid-Bay region. So in fact, I'm gonna see if I can't find my darn worksheet I put together today on my other screen, because I can tell you. Let's see here. We did 12 Calvert County reef ball builds, 12 Carroll County builds. The Carroll County Career and Tech Center Masonry Program. This is 2024. Carroll County Career and Tech. Their goal was to build one single reef ball per day of the school year. I think there's still about 180 days in the school year. So I told them if they build 150, I'll be proud. And they're well on their way. If you're in the Westminster area and you drive through the Career and Tech Center parking lot, you can't miss our reef balls and our reef ball trailer. And then ultimately we did Bush Library in Annapolis. We did the McDonough School, DeMatha School, Francis Scott Key Elementary in Baltimore. We worked with AstraZeneca. Union Brewing and Constellation Energy hosted one back in October. We held an event at Sandy Point State Park with Defensores de la Cuenca, which is Defenders of the Watershed. We did one with St. Peter's and Paul School in Easton, Maryland, and we had an event in Baltimore the first Saturday of September called Oyster Blues and Brews, where we also built reef balls at Port Covington Marina. And then so we did two different deployments in Virginia. We did a Noah's Reef deployment. We did one in Tangier Sound. We did the St. Mary's work I mentioned to you. The Chesapeake Beach deployment. We did a shoreline in the South River, the Hillsmere area, where 100 student-made reef balls are part of a shoreline protection project there, and then the site in Eastern Bay. So quite a busy year for me and one other full-time staff member to accomplish. We set our goals kind of largely based on the stuff I just rambled off. I mean, from a capacity standpoint, we're trying to grow into the Eastern Shore some more, but it kind of comes down to what we're able to build, and we always try and maximize that number. We have a corporate reef ball build structure now where for $5,000, somebody can make a donation and do a reef ball build. And that's why you heard some corporate names there. We also do it with nonprofits and community partners at a 25% discount. There's different ways to work with us as well. I have a young man who's going to borrow some smaller reef ball molds that are about 120 pounds when they're a finished product, maybe 100 pounds. And they're called Oyster size. They're the smallest one made. We've had Eagle Scouts, other different groups just come and borrow the molds. build a handful of reef balls and bring them back as a kind of a project. So there's lots of different ways that we could work together to do something in 2025, and I definitely want to. I'm here in Mount Washington in Baltimore City. It's my home base and my home office, and I travel all over the state, and we're constantly have projects that we're always looking to do, and different partnerships that we want to build. I don't like saying no to anyone. We always find a way to work together, and in the end, it benefits us all. So that was a really long answer to a question, but I see another one related to the carbon emission produced from building reef balls. So we've never done that calculation. We've talked with various funders that look for that kind of information for our specific program, and we've never taken the initiative to do it here in Maryland, largely because of capacity. And ultimately, in talking with, like, there are, I guess, discussions, or there's a couple different sides to the concrete production, the mining of limestone, and those kinds of carbon impacts. And so initially, back of envelope type stuff, it's relatively complicated. I like to think, and I know that ultimately the best carbon sink that there is the ocean ecosystem and a healthy estuaries and bays. My hope is, if we ever put pen to paper to do it, that we would find that the uplift we provide offsets majority of what we cause. Again, it's hard. I mean, we are traveling around the state. It is my absolute goal, and in fact, I've identified a couple locations to have a habitat center. But we've always felt it's most efficient to go to the students where they are and supplement their educational components of their classroom. And ultimately, I think the positives outweigh the benefits, or the negatives of the carbon component. But I'm perfectly willing to find out and try and make improvements, because I think that is important. But ultimately, we need those seagrasses and oysters doing their part. And again, we look at things when it comes on a larger impact. We're on more of a local level, and the nutrient components of what's impacting our waterways, which it's obviously all a system. Nothing ever goes away.
And what percentage of oysters eaten in Maryland come from natural versus aquaculture? Do you have that?
So I do have access to it. I don't know it off. I can give you a rough. So wild harvest last year was right around 700,000 bushels, I think, by that one chart I had, and that may have been 2 years ago. Aquaculture, I want to say, is around a third of that. A third again. So if there's about 1 million bushels being produced, that's probably about right. Maybe 700 to 300,000. But I can get some follow-up numbers and let you all know. Ultimately, they've both been trending up. It was over 700,000 bushels wild in 22 to 23. I think it came back down slightly last year. Another thing is, of course, the economic component of what's impacting the harvest, and whether the harvesters are going out when it comes to total harvest. Like, their dockside bushel value might be something like $35-$45 in the heat of the season, and that's just not much when they have a limit of 12 bushels per day in the wild fishery. So ultimately, if you're seeing something on a raw bar, it's mostly going to be an aquaculture oyster. If it's a single oyster, if it's pretty and clean, if it has a deep cup, it's going to be an aquaculture oyster. If it's more flat, really thick shell, a little more difficult to shuck, still a beautiful thing, it's going to probably be a wild oyster. A lot of like I said, the wild oysters are shucks. So if you're buying shuck pints, shuck gallons, anything from your local stores, they're likely going to be a wild oyster. But again, there's a lot of overlap where the aquaculture guys are harvesting like they would in a wild situation. So they may be wild harvesting this time of year when the season opens, October 1st for some gear, November 1st for other, letting their aquaculture beds rest. Harvesting them in the shoulder seasons is probably what they're doing. You're not technically allowed to take wild oysters and put them on an aquaculture lease, but there's people doing that sometimes, where the undersized ones caught wild, if they're not seen, get put onto the lease, and they get to grow up on the lease and then sold as if they were farm raised. There's a lot of complexity out there in Chesapeake, and a lot of places to do things that you want to do when nobody's looking. But in general, the industry is growing, and that's all a good thing for all of us. There's really a good system in place also from a health and safety perspective for all oysters. My wife will kick me under the table when I ask the waitress too many questions about oysters on a menu at a restaurant. But ultimately, in every single restaurant, there is a tag. That tag says the harvest date, who the harvester was, what the NOAA code was, so federally laid out regions of the bay. And ultimately, you can trace back to the farm if something were to happen, to you if you got sick by eating an oyster. generally speaking, a reasonably healthy person should not expect any impact from eating a raw oyster, but there's of course risk. Let your nose be your guide. If you shuck it, it should smell briny. It should smell like the bay or like the ocean, but it shouldn't smell rotten. It shouldn't be dry. Oysters create their liquor in their shell that they live in, and that's the juice. That's part of what makes them taste good. If it's dry, it's probably trending towards not good anymore. I have some in my fridge that I got the day before Thanksgiving, and they're still mostly good. They'll last more, as long as they're in the fridge, and especially if you put them cupped down so that all their juices can stay inside, they'll last a little bit longer. And I'm actually picking up some more tomorrow, so I highly recommend to add them to your holiday wish list.
Absolutely. All right, Steve, did you want to talk a little bit more as we continue on? Did you have another question for David?
I'm putting in the chat. I'm putting, just while I can before he gets going, I put in the chat a little link that y'all might want to check out. It's kind of neat. If you're into maps, it's a GIS system with various layers that show the different uses of the waterways. It's built so that potential aquaculture folks can actually zoom around and figure out if they're going to lease a bottom or not. I can actually share it real quick, give you an idea of what we're talking about. So on the left, there's a different layers you can turn on and off. The red is, Yates Bar, I believe. No, I'm not sure right now. It's a public shellfish fishery area. The black line is a Yates Bar. So there's oysters down here is the point. These are subaquatic vegetation, submerged aquatic vegetation, SAV. This is a lease right here, TA whatever. And I'm clicking the button right now and it'll pop up the information of who the leaseholder is and some of the details. So my connection's not great. But ultimately that's a lease that they have right there. The reef site that we deployed at yesterday is right here. That's why I had this up. I was going to show it to y'all, but it didn't load correctly and exactly show the MARI box. But the Maryland Artificial Reef Initiative, I had it turned off. It was operator error. MARI is laid out on here as well, and so they'll show up in a different color. There's one popped up right here. I just realized I'm on the wrong part of the map. This is the Tillman Island Reef site. So this is Tillman Island, not where I thought I was. These purple lines right here are actually some of our reef balls. So the pop-up window should show something in regard to that. And this is why we have a permit system. All the records are available. We are working on a map that one of our volunteers is doing, which will highlight every single deployment that's been done across the history of the Maryland Artificial Reef Initiative. But the video you watched is actually this site. I don't think that's going to load. I'll zoom out to give you a better idea of where you are. There's Tillman Island, there's Poplar Island, Chesapeake Beach is over here, Annapolis, and then also, up here in Baltimore. Baltimore's further up here. So those green areas are the sanctuaries. And it kind of gives you different overlays. The pink areas are areas where there's restricted shellfish harvesting, so nobody will be leasing those or wild harvesting in those regions. You can see like the town of Cambridge right here. The reason that you cannot eat oysters right out in front of the town of Cambridge, does anyone want to guess why we can't eat oysters from right there? Or any of these other high upper areas of tributaries that are closed? Any guesses? Nope, not a national park. What do towns have? Contamination. You're on the right track. Wastewater treatment. Yes. And so wastewater treatment is the reason why, and it's the bacterial levels that exist in that portion of the Choptank River. And so constant monitoring shows that there's never a point at which the department felt it was necessary or acceptable to allow people to eat oysters. The reason it's up here in these upper tributaries could be because of human impacts, but largely they could be because of agricultural impacts, or just the fact that there's not a lot of water turnover up in there. And so there's natural bacteria which exist like in a marshy area. Without a human impact, there would probably be places where if you ate oysters, there's a higher chance of bacteria and you'll get sick. So even if you're in some of the most wild places in the world that look pristine and beautiful, they could have levels that can impact you. So be smart when it comes to oysters and spread the word. We want folks to stay healthy and not ever have any negative impact on the industry, which is thoroughly tracked and shut down if and when there's ever spills in any of these areas that could impact where leasing is allowed.
Okie dokie.
Okay, is the Patricia Campbell still up in Shadyside? Yes. So she's pulled out for the season. Our project at Chesapeake Beach was October 28th, and that was her last project this year. Their setting tanks are in Shadyside at oh gosh, what's it called? PCL, something landing. Parish Creek Landing is the marina where they have their office right now. And if you go to the end of the peninsula there's 5 setting tanks that we use this summer. So I've driven in and out of that place. I can't tell you how many times this year, because that's where we're storing some reef balls. They have some potential plans down the road to move around the corner, but they are doing a number of projects next year in the South River and Anne Arundel County, general Anne Arundel County area with reef balls and setting spat on them.
All right. Well, let's, Steve, do you have any comments right now while we finish up for the evening?
Fantastic, Lloyd. Worked on the Patricia Campbell. Will you be proud to know that, so the Campbell Foundation, Patricia, the namesake there, the Campbell Foundation is one of our supporters. Keith Campbell, their founder, Keith Campbell, the founder of their foundation, is a longtime member and supporter of CCA, who's done so much for the Bay and supported nonprofits like big and small to get a lot of this work done.
Can you hear me, Dave?
Yes.
Hi, this is Steve King. I want to commend you on the great work that you've done personally, and the great work that the organization has done and continues to do. And I think education is particularly with the schools is a key component to eventual success in the whole effort. But I'm concerned that we're so far behind in terms of the number of oysters in the Bay versus the number that were here before 1865, that it's going to take thousands of years to get to the point where the oyster, the keystone species, as you referred to it, is restored to the point where it can regulate the amount of algae in the Bay like it used to be able to do. Mm-hmm. And so, and I just turned 71 years old a couple weeks ago, and I was hoping that sometime in my life or my children's life, we would see the Bay restored to the pristine condition that it used to be. But the only way that I can see that happen is through a major public-private effort to try to restore the reefs that used to, a major portion of the reefs that used to be out in the Bay, as John Smith called them, the oyster rocks. Mm-hmm. And I'd like to hear your thoughts on that conundrum.
So, you ever heard the old joke I know Ronald Reagan told about the 2 kids on Christmas that come down the steps and they're excited and they're getting ready to open their presents. Santa Claus has come and the room's full of horse poop. Well, one of the kids is crying his eyes out. Oh, we got horse poop for Christmas. The other kid jumps into the room and starts throwing all the poop, looking all around, going, wee, woo, woo, wee. Well, the second kid, they stop him and they go, little Johnny, why are you playing with all the horse poop? And he goes, well, with all this horse poop somewhere, there's got to be a pony somewhere. I'm that kid. And the people I get to work with are those kids, saying, you know what, we can figure it out. And there's no question we have to understand where we've come from and see the mistakes that we've made. But I've been involved in making the solutions as well long enough to realize how ridiculous we are as a species, where we continually put up create conflict and create these reasons why we're not doing good work. And I have to constantly go, well, wait, look at all the good work we did, even in these conditions. So whether it's the depressed condition of the bay that still provides so much joy and so many great things for so many people, or just the reality that we're getting these things done. And ultimately with every single reef ball, what drives me is I know we can make the connection to people that are going to be stewards for the future. And regardless of the baseline that they understand, they're going to have an opportunity to improve it a little bit. And I look at the St. Mary's River example, that reef you talked about. Had that never been done, that example never would have been there. And the ecosystem benefit that's occurring in that stretch of the river wouldn't be there. So piece by piece by piece, I think the Chesapeake Bay is moving in different directions in different places, but I see plenty of positives in what's happening with the health of it in certain places. I won't find many of them around Annapolis because again, there's too many, I think, misguided actions and just people missing the real prize here, which is knowing that future generations will enjoy the bay that we all enjoyed. And so frankly, there's one way to get it done. It's to roll up the sleeves, get it done, go out and do it every day. Tomorrow I'm going to fish with Jay for 3 hours, and then I'm hauling reef balls to the Graysonville dump to get ready for future deployments. And it's just all we can do, one day at a time. Again, I working in policy, watching all the conflict, whether it be on a national level or a local level, I sometimes scratch my head and wish people would spend more time on the positive and finding their neighbors and their people that they can work with to get the job done, no matter what it is. I just left a really contentious week of Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission stuff, people fighting and yelling and screaming. I've been called all sorts of things in my inbox and my email this week. And, I always look back at the famous Teddy Roosevelt quote of, or statement of being in the arena and being willing to just deal with it because somebody had to. And, you look at the wall behind me. These are all pieces of a life lived outdoors with people that I love and things that I care about. And I tell people to just kind of try and focus on the positive of it all. There is negative there of 100%, but focus on the positive and make the positive because all these experiences and the people I did them with are worth it, that I'm going to pass on to my kids in the future as well. And there's one of our volunteers, a guy named Wayne Young. He's been writing these books. He's 78 years old. He said insomnia is a real SOB. So he sits up at night researching and writing these books. And this is kind of his mark on the future, people knowing what's happening under the water of the Chesapeake Bay. And these are the things that give me the tremendous bright spots. And I was actually just honored to write the foreword for Chesapeake Fishing Reefs #3. And I kind of spoke to this. We only know what we were told happened before us. We always try and want to get back there, but the reality is we have the here and now. And I kind of told just a simple story of my great-grandfather being kind of the spark in my lineage that I know of. Self-employed painting contractor, lived in Ferndale, would go down to the Magathie River, put out his rowboat, catch a few fish, bring them back, and taught my dad how to clean fish, how to cook fish, pass that on to him. My dad passed it on to me. And so even if I'm not going to have a rowboat full of beautiful white perch and yellow perch from the Magathie River, I can repeat that beautiful experience, which can be passed on to generations in a different way in a different part of the bay. So again, I'm an eternal optimist, and I'm going to continue looking for the darn pony, regardless of what the stats tell us, because I know the work that we do is making a difference, even if a small one.
Well, I think that is a wonderful place to end it tonight. Thank you so much, David. I look forward to finding ways that the Natural History Society and CCA can work together to continue the good work and looking for the positives. So on that note, everybody, it's been a wonderful year of Must Learn Thursdays with everyone. We look forward to next year. And in the meantime, stay well, stay curious, stay outside, and we'll see you next year in 2025. Take care, everybody.
Thank you all. Happy holidays.